since you all had me speak before, I want to be a little bit brief this time, because I'm also yearning to hear back from the room, so if we can create space for that to happen, that would be wonderful. I think one of the things that I often struggle with is, and this is something that you can draw on even just by looking back at women's rights work, and when you're speaking in contexts that are not, when you're speaking in a different context, is how is it that you frame an issue that allows people to hear the complexities of the issue? How do you talk about being queer in Africa without people immediately hitting on the register of violence and lack of safety and impossibility? I was talking to a friend of mine who's an African but has been raised out of the continent since she was a child. And I was telling her about sitting in Nairobi at a salon, which is the only place where I get to read beauty magazines. And there was this magazine, I was flipping through it. It's a Kenyan magazine. And at the back of the magazine, they normally feature people's homes. And one of the homes they featured in this particular issue was a home of 2 women. And I remember looking back and saying, huh? Really? They were not sisters, they were not relatives, they were 2 women. It became evident to me, even though that is not what was lifted up in the piece, that these were 2 women who were living together, who clearly had an intimate relationship. And I remember taking a picture of that and sending it to a bunch of people and saying, my goodness, this is absolutely, this is great that this can happen in this country. Because we can pretend that people are not going to read between the lines, but right in front of you there was a beautiful home shared by 2 Kenyan women who were talking about their life together in Nairobi. So this friend of mine asked me, is it possible for queer people to live their lives openly in Nairobi? And I said, yes, it is possible. Now we can complicate that. If you're talking about Kenya specifically, class dynamics are going to definitely influence the possibilities of freedom. If I have more money, if I work in a particular environment, it means that I make choices because of my access to resources about where I hang out. I make choices about the friends that I keep. I make choices about the clubs that I go to. I have the possibilities of buying a home and living in particular neighborhoods, which means that my access or my distance from violence and homophobic narratives becomes smaller because of the circles that I choose to operate in. The questions of choice that is deeply linked to resources. In that same city, you will find somebody else who has one of those, who does not have access to those choices because of the class structure of our society. So these are the sorts of conversations that we need to have about what it means to live on a continent. So just as she was talking about questions of transition, it's wonderful to have an institutional, a state-based framework that allows for that. But how, therefore, do you translate that in real terms for people who actually want to access, the institutions and, who actually want to translate the policy framework into lived reality? This is where the class and racial dynamics then complicate the narrative a little bit more. But you will find in that same South Africa people who have transitioned, people who are able to get resources and travel elsewhere in order to go through their transitional processes. So it's this complicated discussion that I think I want to center for us when we're reflecting about what it means to be queer on the African continent. A couple of years ago, I was visiting London. I wasn't living in the UK at the time, and I was walking on the Strand. Now, the Strand is on the West End, lots of, the theatre scene, that's sort of the hub of that. And right in front of me was this, what I read to be a gay man, extremely flamboyant, and he knew his hips could move and they were moving, and he was in all his wonderful glory. And I was walking behind him and I smiled. I thought, well, that's beautiful. But what struck me was the number of other people around me who was staring at him in absolute shock, like what's going on there, laughing, giggling, and pointing. This is London, the land of the so-called free and the home of freedom, the space from which governments, governments in those countries can make demands about what our governments need to do differently about questions of freedoms and rights. I think, and this is what I would like to hear from you, that I think there's a way in which we position what it means, and there's a question of relativity, of course. I think we can think about what it means to be a queer person in Germany and position that as representing possibilities of freedom. I would like to hear a little bit more about how free is it in real terms? You know, how free are your lives in real terms, living in a context in which the law has created a situation that you cannot be discriminated against, because that's what laws do, yes? They say you can hold your discriminatory thoughts and ideas, but you will not do it because the law has said you will not do it. It does not mean there are no homophobes in Europe. They're just not going to speak out because the law has said you cannot do that, because we do not allow discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexuality. So to begin to understand how this manifests in a lot of our societies, even in so-called free societies, would be important, because the complication there arises from when we begin to think about the class and race dynamics within those societies. What does it mean for migrant communities who are in countries such as Germany and who happen to be queer? What happens then in these free societies that we live in? The third and final point that I want to speak to is around the ways in which patriarchy continues to influence to a great degree how we navigate queer lives all over, whether you're sitting on the African continent or sitting elsewhere. And that there are huge lessons that we must draw from feminist thinking, feminist activism, about how we think differently about how we are and how we bring ourselves, whether you woke up one morning and discovered that you are, or whether you knew that you are, and you are non-heterosexual, let me specify that. How we bring ourselves into imagining a different way of being. Intellectually and politically, I believe that what queer lives do is disrupt in a very powerful way the ways in which we think about heterosexuality, heteronormativity. But because of commodification, because of the ways our lives have become commodified, because of the ways in which the state creates a situation that you have to buy into certain institutions in order to access resources. So marriage, for instance, as a thing that people are now aspiring to, because the state has created a situation that if you access this institution, then you have access to a whole range of other things. You can share a data plan on your phone and reduce costs. You can share health insurance, you know. These are all state-created structures that force people, that regiment people into particular institutions. So you're not actually accessing any freedom, you know. I always believe love can be demonstrated in any way. That institution does not validate your love. That institution is not the thing that will make your family and loved ones recognize that this person is significant in your lives. So how do we think very robustly about how we step back into very heteronormative, patriarchal tendencies because of the ways in which our societies are structured to force us back there, even if we are resisting. But also the ways in which resources that are shaping activism on the African continent reinforce that particular narrative. So because of the whole, what's that wonderful thing? I know I did not retweet it. Love is love, what is that hashtag? Love matters, or love is love, something, you know, because of all the sort of steps that happen in the US around, you know, the marriage, love wins, there you go. That then gets transported into activism on the African continent as a thing that we must now pursue, right? But yet, on a daily basis, when you talk to people on the front line of queer activism on the African continent, marriage is the last thing that people are concerned about. People are concerned about access to adequate healthcare. People are concerned that they want to be able to see a doctor without, you know, without being turned away. You know, you want to be able to see a doctor who understands that your life is much more nuanced than living with a man or being married to a man or having children. And that sometimes your life is even much more nuanced, that you might present in certain ways and produce a child as well. And that might complicate the ways in which they're thinking about you. And I want to close with a small story. So it's simple things like this around how our healthcare systems operate, you know. And again, this was not in Dakar, this was not in Accra, this was not in Dar es Salaam, this was in the United Kingdom, you know. So these are the kinds of the kinds of shifts that need to happen about making queer lives legible, possible, whether we're talking about the African continent or whether we're talking about other parts of the world.